Good morning, guys. So as folks are getting logged in, as usual, please do go ahead and sign in. And when we get a few more people, I'll start to go over some announcements. All right, so as folks are getting signed in, logged in and signed in, just a few matters of house cleaning that I wanted to review with you guys. All right, so you guys should be seeing the Canvas page here. We do have the third essay assignment coming up due on Thursday by midnight. There we go. Yeah, that's due Thursday, April 23rd by midnight. And also I wanted to also mention the fifth quiz that is due on April 30th. You guys have 9 days on that. And we are on the home stretch here. We're starting our chapter on psychopathology today, which is the topic of mental illness. And then our last chapter, chapter 15, will deal with the topic of mental health treatment. So I wanted to just also mention that if we get to the point where I run out of time and I don't have enough class meetings left to cover everything that I would like to cover in chapter 15, I was thinking that I would just record an extra lecture, even if it's not a live class meeting. I'll just record what's left as an addendum lecture, and I will post the recording for you guys to watch. That way I can cover everything that I need to cover without leaving anything important out. If we get to that point, then that's what I'll do. If I just get behind to the point where I haven't been able to cover everything that I would have liked, I'll just record an extra lecture for you guys. And that's how I will handle that. And if we get to that point, I'll let you guys all know. Okay, so most of you guys have signed in at this point. And I've also noticed that a number of you guys have gone in and done some of the extra credit assignments. A couple of folks did the one on gender, which is the infamous Kathy Newman, Jordan Peterson video, which honestly isn't the best model of how a conversation should happen between two people who disagree, because the interviewer, Kathy Newman, puts a lot of words in Jordan Peterson's mouth, and some of you guys who have done the assignment have noticed that, and it really becomes more of just a session of her kind of badgering him and putting words in his mouth, and she's not perhaps the best opponent for him. There are other exchanges that he's done that can be found on YouTube where he actually has reasonable conversations with people that he disagrees with, like Sam Harris, for example, and others, where there's less of that sort of badgering, interrupting kind of ambiance going on. But the reason that I included that video was because it was relevant to the topic of gender, and it was a video that's gotten a lot of airtime on YouTube. Lots of people have watched it. Very controversial, and I was just kind of curious how you guys would react to it. So in any case, we'll go ahead and jump into our chapter on mental illness. Okay, I was having an issue with my webcam there for a second. All right, so chapter 14 deals with the topic of psychopathology. This is one of those big words. Full screen here. You guys should have a full screen view of the slides. Let me know if that's not the case. But psychopathology is one of those big words that it just means mental illness. That's all it means. So psychopathology, pathology meaning illness, and of course psycho relating to the mind. So psychopathology is just the terminology that we use to refer to mental illnesses, broadly speaking. And the idea of studying mental illness or psychopathology from a medical perspective, from a more scientifically minded perspective, this is a relatively new thing in human history. And we're still honing it, to be honest. As we've seen in this course, we've encountered numerous ideas from theorists who disagree with each other. And there still is not, to some degree, there's a lack of consensus on a lot of the ideas that we've explored in this course. And there are disagreements about the nature of mental illness. But we have moved in the direction of having a more medically minded, a more scientifically driven view of mental illness compared to times past. Throughout human history until very recently, and in fact, this is still the case in many areas of the world, mental illness was considered to be variously the result of demonic possession. Maybe a witch had cast a spell on you. Maybe it was a moral failing. Maybe it was related to the lunar cycles, hence the term lunacy, and the term lunatic is related to this old school idea that mental illness was a function of the lunar cycles. Some people still believe that that's the case. Some people still believe that demonic possession causes mental illness. I actually attended a small Southern Baptist church growing up, tiny little Southern Baptist church that had less than 30 members. And I remember as a teenager when I was struggling with depression for the first time, and depression is an issue that I've struggled with from time to time throughout my adult life, and I successfully have it managed at this point largely through nutrition, exercise, meditation practice, living a more self-disciplined lifestyle. There have been points at which also I've had to utilize medication to deal with it as well. But in any case, the first time I had a depressive episode when I was a teenager, the pastor of my church, which was this tiny little Southern Baptist church, when he found out that I was struggling with depression, his suggestion was that if I would just have everyone in the church pray over me, then that would make my depression go away, because it was his belief that I was being attacked by evil spirits, and if I just had everyone in the church pray over me, then it would make my depression go away, which it didn't work, by the way. So this is reflective of a very kind of old school view of mental illness, that it's somehow related to some kind of metaphysical or spiritual causes or other such superstitious beliefs. And I don't mean to cast disparagement at anyone in the class who's religious and has religious views, but as a whole, the field of psychology aims to embrace a medical, scientifically driven view of mental illness, as opposed to some of these older, more superstitious rather. These older, more superstitious ways of approaching the topic. And in fact, it wasn't until 1952 that the very first medical handbook of mental illnesses was published, the first systematic attempt at a scientific medical understanding of mental illness and categorization. Didn't happen until 1952, when the very first edition of the DSM came out, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it's diagnostic in the sense that it gives a list of the recognized mental disorders and the criteria for diagnosing them. And it's statistical in the sense that it provides statistics on the prevalence rates of various mental illnesses and So it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. First edition, published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952, not to be confused with the American Psychological Association, which serves a different function, and it's the American Psychological Association that produces the publication manual that we use to format our papers with. But it's the American Psychiatric Association that publishes the DSM. Does anybody know the difference between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist? The essential difference?
Psychiatrists can prescribe medicine and they're medical doctors.
Exactly, yeah. So a psychiatrist, as Chris said, is someone who's been to medical school and they have legal authorization to prescribe medications. So if you're approaching a mental health diagnosis from a medical standpoint in terms of wanting to treat it through medication, then chances are you'll be dealing with a psychiatrist. Now, increasingly these days, primary care doctors are prescribing these medications as well. They're not as well trained to do so, but the medical doctors who are trained to deal with mental illness are psychiatrists, as opposed to a clinical psychologist is someone who has a doctoral degree, usually a PhD. Sometimes it might be a PsyD, which means Doctorate of Psychology. But these are folks who are, their doctorate is in the diagnosis of mental illness and treatment through psychotherapy. So a clinical psychologist can diagnose mental illness and will usually treat mental illness through talk therapy of some kind. We'll talk about different approaches to talk therapy in the next chapter. Whereas a psychiatrist, they can diagnose, but the way that they have a tendency to treat using medication. So that's the major difference between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist. So anyway, the DSM came out in 1952, and it's undergone a number of revisions over the years. The 5th edition of the DSM came out, I want to say in 2012 or 13, if I'm remembering correctly. I was trained on the 4th edition of the DSM, which was in place when I was in graduate school. And then after I finished my master's degree in psychology, the 5th edition came out. I never did obtain a copy of the 5th edition. I still have my DSM 4th edition here, which I dug up to show you guys. Sorry, I didn't mean to hit the microphone there. But this is a 4th edition DSM, and this version was retired when the 5th edition came out. So this is a little out of date at this point, but I still have my copy for historical purposes, and I still even have some of the pages bookmarked here from my grad school days. But this was the 4th edition, and the 5th edition came out in, like I said, I want to say 2012. That information's in your textbook. And there are always changes that happen from one edition to the other. So for example, and this is controversial, some people say this is proof that, that the DSM really isn't scientific, that it's more of a political document. I wouldn't go so far as to say there's no science in it, but I would acknowledge that to a certain degree, the DSM is in fact a political document, and to some degree is a document that reflects the state of our culture at the time that it comes out. So for example, in 1952, our society was much less tolerant towards gay people. And in 1952, when the first DSM came out, homosexuality was categorized in the first edition of the DSM as being a mental illness. So if you were gay and your doctor found out about it, you probably ended up getting diagnosed as being mentally ill. It was considered a mental illness in under the first DSM. And I think it was the 2nd edition or the 3rd edition that removed homosexuality as a mental health diagnosis, so that mental health professionals no longer consider homosexuality to be a mental illness, as it was come to be accepted more widely in our culture. It was no longer seen as pathological. And some folks might argue that that is a mix of both a scientific change in viewpoint, but also a cultural change as well. So sometimes you see some of these cultural changes reflected in the DSM. And there's some degree of that you will observe, to which the DSM is influenced by politics and by culture. So that's one example. Also, names of mental illnesses tend to get changed over the years. So the first 3 editions of the DSM, there was a mental illness called manic depressive disorder that you could get diagnosed with. That no longer exists as a diagnosis. They changed the name of it when the 4th DSM came out, which I just showed you guys. When the DSM-4 came out, They changed the name of manic depressive disorder to bipolar disorder. It's the same thing, but they just changed the name of it. Another change that happened from the 4th to the 5th DSM is that Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis was removed. So in that DSM-4 that I just showed you guys, you will find in there Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis. But they got rid of Asperger's syndrome, and now in the DSM-5, it's just considered a subtype of autism. So that if you previously had a diagnosis of Asperger's under the DSM-4, now under the 5, you just get diagnosed as having high-functioning autism. So they make little tweaks like that. Certain disorders get added and removed. And sometimes there are controversies about whether or not certain disorders should be in there. So for example, there's been a big controversy over the years about whether or not sex addiction should be considered a DSM diagnosis. They've got alcohol addiction in there. They've got marijuana addiction in there. But there's no sex addiction in the DSM. And when they were working on the DSM-5, they were giving serious consideration to including sex addiction as a diagnosis in the 5, and they ultimately decided not to. They decided to keep it out yet again. And this infuriated a lot of addiction treatment specialists who believe very firmly that that sex addiction is a real thing, and they wanted it to be included in the DSM so they could charge, their clients insurance for treating their so-called sex addictions. And I'm not denying that it exists. I'm not an expert on that, but the authors of the DSM concluded that sex addiction is not a real thing, and that it's just more of an impulse control issue, right? It's just an issue of self-control rather than a bona fide addiction. So it wasn't included. And what that means is if you believe that you have a sex addiction and you go to a sex addiction treatment specialist for help with that, that specialist cannot charge your health insurance for that treatment. So in order for your insurance to pay for your psychotherapy, you've got to have a DSM bona fide diagnosis that you're diagnosed with, usually, before your health insurance will pay for therapy. So as a result of that, folks who are seeking treatment for sex addiction, that's not going to be paid for by your health insurance. You're going to have to pay for that psychotherapy out of pocket because the American Psychiatric Association does not acknowledge that sex addiction actually is a real thing, right? And that's really controversial. Some clinical psychologists and therapists are adamant that it's a real thing that real people have, and other professionals in the field, other clinicians and professional therapists do not believe that it exists, and they're on the side of they side with the American Psychiatric Association on that. So this is just one example of how the DSM is a document that's constantly in flux, and there are disagreements among even the professionals about whether or not certain disorders should be in there. And, to some degree, it is a document that is shaped by socio-political forces. It's undeniable that that's the case. But with that fact aside, it is our attempt at a scientific and medical classification of mental illnesses. And I'm sure the DSM-6, whenever it comes out, whenever that is, that will be a document that's different from the 5 in some ways, and there will be people who aren't happy with it. And that's always been the case. There have always been controversies about the DSM, and I'm sure that'll continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. It's never going to be a document that's going to make everybody happy. Okay, so when we talk about psychopathology, it's important that we recognize that diagnosing a mental illness is not always straightforward. Sometimes people are just eccentric. Sometimes people are just weird, right? And we can't necessarily diagnose someone with a mental illness just because they're weird. I had a math professor when I was in college. He actually still works at PSC right now. He still teaches math here at PSC. I won't say who he is. But I had a math professor who wore rubber gloves when lecturing. And I don't know if he still does this. But he used a lot of chalk. And I later came to find out that the reason why he used rubber gloves was because his skin, for whatever reason, had this reaction to chalk particles, and I don't know if it was an allergic reaction or whatever, but his skin had a negative reaction to chalk, and that's the reason why he wore rubber gloves while he was lecturing, to keep the chalk dust off of his hands. And that makes perfect sense to me now. But back at the time, we didn't know this when we were students in his class, and a lot of us just thought he was weird and eccentric because he wore these rubber gloves while lecturing. We're like, wow, how strange is that, right? But he actually had a reason to do this, right? So we can't always be so quick to just assume that somebody's mentally ill because they engage in a behavior that's strange or unusual. They might actually have a real reason, a bona fide reason to engage in that behavior, like in the case of the math professor who wore the rubber gloves to keep chalk off of his hands, to keep his skin from getting irritated from all the chalk, right? So, being weird, being strange is not enough. That's the first criteria that we see here in this slide. Does the behavior pattern deviate from social norms? So that is one thing that we look at, but it's not enough. So the two things that we usually look at as lay people when it comes to people's behavior surrounding psychopathology is we ask ourselves questions 1 and question 4. Is this strange, basically, is question 1. And question 4 is, does it weird other people out? Does it cause discomfort and concern to others? So those two are part of the set of questions. Yes, we are concerned with whether or not this behavior pattern deviates from social norms, and we are concerned about whether or not it weirds other people out and makes other people uncomfortable. But those two things by themselves aren't enough to call a behavior pattern psychopathology. The behavior pattern also has to be maladaptive. So that means that the behavior pattern needs to negatively affect the person's life in some way or another, right? So when we say that something's maladaptive, we're meaning that it's a behavior pattern that's causing significant problems in the person's life. When we say self-destructive, that's pretty self-explanatory, but self-destructive ultimately means is this a behavior pattern that if it persists could lead to a negative impact on the person's health, their physical health, or maybe even death, right? So take, for example, a mental illness like anorexia, very self-destructive. Some of you guys might not be aware of this, but anorexia nervosa is actually the most fatal of all the mental health diagnoses. And I probably won't talk very much about eating disorders in this chapter, but it is instructive to know that anorexia nervosa is the most fatal. It has the highest mortality rate of all the mental illnesses in the DSM. A lot of people aren't aware of that fact. Even worse than depression, even worse than schizophrenia. Anorexia has a very high kill rate. So it's a very self-destructive mental illness. So the more of these questions that you can answer yes to, the higher the likelihood that you're dealing with psychopathology. But just being weird is not enough. Just being eccentric is not enough to warrant a mental health diagnosis. And knowing where that line is, takes some training. It's a little bit of a fuzzy line sometimes, and it's a little bit of an art and also science, but you've got to have a professional background of experience with this to really know where that line is. And I am not a professional clinician, by the way. So when I speak about mental illnesses, I'm speaking from a general level of knowledge that I have enough knowledge to talk about this stuff in an intro level course, but I would not be considered specialized enough in this to teach a course on mental illness, like psychopathology, for example. That would be, probably a course that would be taught by a clinical psychologist or a professional mental health worker. So my level of knowledge when it comes to this stuff is enough for an intro level course, but I'm not a professional clinician. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind, so that if you guys come up with any questions that I don't know the answer to, maybe cut me a little slack, because my level of knowledge here is kind of at it's general, right? I'm not a specialist in this. Okay, so before we jump into specific mental illnesses today, I want to talk a little bit about etiology. Does anybody know what the word etiology means? Anybody with a medical background? Etiology means cause of illness. So when we talk about the etiology of a disease, we're talking about the cause of the disease. So for example, the etiology of COVID-19 is the coronavirus. You contract the coronavirus and you develop the illness of COVID-19. So COVID-19 is the illness, coronavirus is the cause. That's the etiology. The etiology behind AIDS is HIV, the HIV virus, right? So the cause of an illness is the etiology of that illness. The cause of a heart attack is usually plaques in your arteries that have built up over time. Heart disease, right? Arteriosclerosis is the medical term for it. So any particular illness, there's a cause for that illness. And we look at mental health in a similar way. And there are different ideas about the etiology of mental illness. The two dominant approaches right now to mental health or to psychopathology etiology, rather, are the diathesis stress model and the biopsychosocial approach. And there's a lot of overlap between these two models. They're not terribly different from each other, but it's just a matter of what they tend to emphasize. So the diathesis stress model is a model of mental illness that says that mental illness is basically caused by two things interacting with each other. You have a genetic predisposition to a certain mental illness, which is called a diathesis, and environmental stressors play on that vulnerability to bring out the illness. So in order to develop a particular mental illness, according to this model, you have to have two things. You have to have the genetic vulnerability, and you have to have sufficient environmental stressors to bring out the mental illness that plays on that vulnerability. So to give a concrete example of this, schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness, which we'll talk about. Not today, we won't have time to get to that today, but we will get to it. It's one of the most serious mental illnesses there are, and it is a debilitating mental illness that requires lifelong management and care. And it's sometimes referred to as the cancer of mental illnesses, whereas depression is sometimes referred to as the common cold of mental illnesses. But in any case, schizophrenia is one of the most serious mental illnesses. And research has identified a strong genetic influence, meaning that it's highly heritable. So when we say that an illness is heritable, what we mean by that is if something is highly heritable, that means there's a strong genetic influence on the occurrence of the disease. Like Alzheimer's, for example, is highly heritable as well. So schizophrenia, it turns out, is highly heritable, meaning that if you have a parent with schizophrenia, you are much more likely than a member of the general population selected at random to develop the disease yourself. If you have a sibling with schizophrenia, you are much more likely to develop the disease yourself. And this has been studied in twin studies. And they found, for example, that identical twins, when one has schizophrenia, there's an incredibly high likelihood of the other identical twin developing the disorder as well, a much higher likelihood than a person selected at random from the population developing the disorder. So we know that schizophrenia is highly heritable. So let's take a concrete example to illustrate this. Before I get to the concrete example, actually, I need to add one more factor here. We also know that certain environmental stressors are correlated with the occurrence of schizophrenia. For example, we know from population studies that schizophrenia occurs at a significantly higher rate in big cities than it does in smaller rural areas. And that's even when you account for population size. It's not just that you're seeing more schizophrenia because there's more people in a big city. That's not it. When you account for population size, even still, schizophrenia occurs at a much higher rate in urban environments, big cities, than it does in rural environments. Okay, so maybe there's something about the stress of big city life, the fast pace of living, that brings out the disease. So let's give a concrete example. Let's say we have two identical twins and they have a parent who has schizophrenia, right? Maybe dad has schizophrenia, and we've got two identical twins, and one decides to stay living in his hometown his entire life. and lives a relatively low-paced, relatively lower stress life, and takes a job that's relatively lower stress. And that's subjective. So what's stressful for one person might not be as stressful for another. But let's say one twin stays in the hometown and they get a job for the rest of their life, working as a bagger in a grocery store, or even maybe they get a job working as the assistant store manager, whatever. But it's relatively less stress than the amount of stress that the other twin's going to face, because the other twin is going to move to New York City and work on Wall Street and become a Wall Street shark, and one of these people who's spends their entire day on the New York Stock Exchange. And that's an extremely high stress, by the way, for a lot of folks. Or maybe they move to New York City and they take a job as an air traffic controller at LaGuardia Airport, which is a really high stress job, right? Air traffic controllers are notorious for facing a lot of stress on the job. So one twin accepts a rather low-paced lifestyle in their hometown, which is a relatively small town. The other identical twin moves to New York City and takes a high-paced, high-stress, but also higher-paying job, right? Well, according to what we know from the diathesis stress model, we could predict that there's a high likelihood that the twin that moves to the big city is going to be much more likely to develop schizophrenia than the twin who stays in the hometown with a relatively lower pace, lower stress lifestyle, right? So you have a genetic vulnerability, but it takes the right environmental stressors to bring that vulnerability out. And that's the essence of the diathesis stress model. The other major approach that has received a lot of airtime in recent years among people who study psychopathology is the biopsychosocial approach. And there's a lot of overlap here between these two models, but I would just say the biopsychosocial approach tries to take a little bit of a broader view of the person than just focusing on stress and genes. So the diathesis stress model is basically just focused exclusively on genetics and environmental stress. But the biopsychosocial approach zooms out a little bit. So it includes that stuff, but it zooms out a little bit and says, let's look at all of the areas of a person's life. So you want to be familiar with their biological health, which would include genetics, their diet, exercise patterns, their overall physical health. You would want to factor that in to your understanding of that person's mental health. But then you would also want to factor in their psychological states, including maybe their IQ, maybe their personality, maybe their motivational states, their learning history from a behaviorist perspective. All of these things you would include under the psychological domain. But then if you really want to understand what a person's going through, you can't just look at their biology and their psychology. You also have to have a picture of their social life. So, what are their family relationships like? Is the person in a healthy relationship or a bad marriage? Does the person have a healthy set of friends that they can rely on for social support? Do they have a decent job with a decent income? How's their socioeconomic status? What sort of culture do they come from? Do they come from a more individualist culture or a more collectivist culture? So it's a much more broad way of looking at the person that tries to look at how these different levels of being intersect to create a person's state of mind. So it's, in a sense, it's a little bit more ambitious because it's trying to include everything, right? And it's a little bit less simplistic of a way of looking at a person. So the diathesis stress model is more zeroed in on genetics and stress. But these two models have been the main models of etiology that have been discussed in recent years, and they're the main two models that your textbook describes as well. And there might be some other models out there of etiology, but these are the prominent two that have received most of the airtime, so to speak, in discussions of the etiology of psychopathology. Okay, so we've gotten through some of the preliminaries here, discussing a little bit of the historical framework on mental illness. We've talked about kind of drawing the line where do you draw the line between strange behavior and psychopathology? In other words, looking at criteria, and we've looked a little bit at etiology. So at this point, I want to go ahead and jump in and explore some specific mental illnesses. And just to reiterate, we're not going to have time to cover every single mental illness listed in the DSM. That would take an entire course, maybe multiple courses, probably graduate level. So this is kind of an overview, and we're touching on some of the more well-known ones, some of the more common ones, the heavy hitters, if you will. So we will start with anxiety disorders. So anxiety disorders are mental illnesses characterized by fear, apprehension, and tension that are disproportionate with the situation eliciting those emotions, right? So if you have a person pointing a loaded gun at your head with their finger on the trigger, and they're pointing it at you saying, give me all your money or you're dead, yeah, you're going to experience some fear. Your heart rate's going to speed up, and you're going to have a fight or flight reaction, and that's that's to be expected, right? But if you're having the same physiological reaction, let's say, to getting on an airplane, or maybe giving a presentation in a class, then that is a level of fear response that is disproportionate to the actual threat, right? So if you're having a fight or flight response about something that's not life-threatening, and it's debilitating to the point where you can't complete your tasks, then we're probably looking at some flavor of an anxiety disorder. So fear and anxiety are often distinguished in the sense that fear is an adaptive response, usually to some actual situation that merits that fear. On the other hand, anxiety, we usually talk about as being a response that is not merited by the situation, right? So fear is adaptive and good when it's appropriate, but anxiety is basically the inappropriate version of fear. It's unwarranted fear, if you will. So some of the more well-known anxiety disorders we're going to talk about today, and we'll get into OCD as well in a few minutes. Probably some of the most well-known and common forms of anxiety disorder are phobias. So a phobia is a fear of, or an anxiety created by a very specific thing, right? So phobias have a specificity to them. So it's a fear of something that is disproportionate to the actual threat, right? So, most people have a little bit of an increased state of tension, like let's say if you're hiking on the side of a mountain, or, rock climbing at a high height, right? And you could fall and hurt yourself. You're probably going to see a little bit of an increase in alertness and heart rate as a result of that. That's normal. But if you're so afraid of heights that you can't get on an airplane or drive across a tall bridge, then that is a fear of that event that is disproportionate to the actual threat. So it's at that point we're talking about a phobia. And the good news about phobias is that they are some of the easiest mental health diagnoses to treat. We have very effective behavioral treatments for phobias now that for a lot of people are able to completely get rid of the phobia. That's the good news. Pardon me for a second. So phobias are among the easiest to treat of the mental illnesses, and they're also considered relatively, in terms of their seriousness, phobias aren't particularly serious for a lot of folks because in a lot of cases you can just avoid the thing that you're afraid of, right? So if you're terrified of snakes, right, you can usually avoid situations in which you might encounter a snake, like maybe don't get into gardening, right? Don't go hiking, and you probably can avoid snakes. Now, where phobias become more serious are when the phobia is related to something that's kind of part of all of our lives, right? If you have a phobia of getting into a moving vehicle, then that's more of a problem because most of us need to get into a moving vehicle at some point or another to get done what we need to get done in life. But if it's something that can be avoided, then it's not that big of a concern in your life. And I'll show you guys a list of some interesting phobias in a second on the next slide. One very common phobia is social anxiety disorder, also known as social phobia, which is a fear of being negatively evaluated by others. And again, behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy in particular, can be particularly effective at treating this. Generalized anxiety disorder is a anxiety disorder that is characterized by a nearly constant state of worry and anxiety that's not targeted towards any specific thing. So this is kind of the opposite of a phobia in the sense that phobias are very specific. Generalized anxiety disorders are folks who are just kind of anxious all the time, and they don't really know what it is that they're anxious about. So like Reginald here in the example, who's feeling very worried and has been for months, but he can't figure out why. It seems as though he is anxious about everything, right? So this is kind of just a constant state of worry. Sometimes folks with generalized anxiety disorder also have what's called panic disorder, which is the presence of panic attacks. A panic attack is a sudden, overwhelming terror. And folks who have panic attacks will tell you that it feels like you're having a heart attack. In fact, a lot of times when folks have a panic attack, if it's their first one, they might mistakenly think they're actually having a heart attack, and they'll show up at the emergency room and they'll run a bunch of tests, and you'll find out that there's nothing wrong with your heart. You haven't had a heart attack. And it's usually at that point that you'll find out that you have panic disorder, that you just had a panic attack. And there are certain medications that can be very effective at treating panic attacks, like Xanax, for example, Valium. There's another one called Ativan. All three of those drugs belong to a class of medications called benzodiazepines, and they're extremely effective at reducing panic attacks. The problem with benzodiazepines, though, is that they're habit forming, and people develop a tolerance to them pretty quickly, so that you have to take more and more of them to get the same effect, and that can get dangerous. And people can end up accidentally overdosing on them, and a lot of folks end up getting addicted to them, and they actually fetch a pretty penny on the street drugs. And also, if you mix those drugs with alcohol, that's extremely dangerous as well. Although some people do it, it's not a wise thing to do. I have a friend who likes to pop a Xanax with a glass of wine, and I keep telling her, you're playing with fire doing this. It's really dangerous to do that, and people die. But she doesn't seem to take it very seriously because she's gotten away with it a few times. But I worry about this person sometimes. Somebody I went to graduate school with. So agoraphobia is a type of anxiety disorder characterized by the fear of being in a situation that you cannot escape from. So the result of this is that these folks usually become shut-ins. They often will stay in their homes without leaving for months. There have been extreme cases I've read about and seen on documentaries where folks have not left their house in years, have not gone out their front door because they're able to order all their stuff online or have friends or family members bring it to them, and they might be able to go extremely long periods of time without ever leaving their home. The root word here, agora, is based upon Greek terminology. Does anybody remember what the agora referred to in Greek?
The agora was the market, I believe.
Yep, that's exactly right. So the agora was the market, and so you could literally interpret the word agoraphobia as fear of the marketplace. And you wouldn't be exactly wrong about that. Folks with agoraphobia probably are not fond of going to the grocery store or the mall, but it's much more than that. It's a fear of being in a situation that you can't escape from. It's a fear of loss of control. So folks with agoraphobia, like I said, usually become shut-ins, not leaving their homes for extremely long periods of time. And hoarding behavior is often something that often goes along with that as well, which is a separate diagnosis, hoarding disorder, which is in the DSM-5, but they're often comorbid. And the term comorbid means mental health diagnoses that tend to occur together, right? So generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder, for example, are often comorbid. Agoraphobia and panic disorder are often comorbid. Agoraphobia and hoarding disorder are often comorbid. depression and substance abuse are often comorbid. So when we say that two disorders have a high degree of comorbidity, we mean that they often occur together. Not always, but they often occur together. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about obsessive compulsive disorder, but before I do, I just thought I would show you guys a list of some humorous and relatively unknown phobias. Some of these I'm skeptical of, honestly. Like there's one on here called panophobia, which is fear of everything. To me, that's nonsense. And I got this out of the textbook, but to me, panophobia is nonsense, because if you're afraid of everything, then that's not a phobia. A phobia is a fear of a specific thing, right? So if you have panophobia, to me, that would just suggest that you have generalized anxiety disorder, which would not count as a phobia. So to me, that one's kind of nonsense in my opinion. But there is one here on the list that I do suffer from, actually. Can anybody guess which one it is?
Mothers-in-law?
Ding, ding, ding. You are correct. That's the one. I suffer from therophobia a couple times a year when I travel to North. Yeah.
I like the fear of gravity. That one's funny.
Yeah. My mother-in-law is an awesome woman, but she's, she's very protective of her daughter, and she's one of these moms-in-laws that I'm kind of speaking a little bit lower now, so the wife's in the next room, but she's one of those mothers-in-laws that can be really critical of her daughter's husband. I'll just put it politely that way. She's a good person though, and we've been getting along in recent years much better. We've really turned a corner. There were a few years where we really we could not tolerate each other's presence, and it was bad for a while. But we've really turned a corner, and I'm happy to say that we've been living in peace and harmony with each other. And the last couple of Christmases have gone down without a hitch. But I still have that little fear that I might piss her off for some little minor infraction, so. But I don't know how much of that is just me, right, projecting. But yeah, my mother-in-law is great. Okay, so hope she never comes across this YouTube video. All right, in any case, let's talk a little bit about OCD. So OCD is a relatively well-known but often misunderstood mental health diagnosis. And this will probably be the last thing that we talk about today, because I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. I have a video for you guys on OCD in a second. This is a mental illness characterized by the presence of both obsessions and compulsions. And it's important to point this out because a lot of folks like to kind of flippantly say, oh, I'm so OCD, right? I like to straighten my pencil on my desk, therefore I'm OCD. Yeah, OCD is a lot more than just needing to straighten your pencil on your desk or having little quirks of perfectionism, right? OCD in its truest form is a debilitating mental health condition. And if you really have it, then unless you've got it under control and successfully treated, your life is going to be severely disrupted by this mental health condition. So you have two things that are present in OCD. You've got obsessions and compulsions. So an obsession is something that you can't quit thinking about. It's something that despite all your efforts, you just can't let go, right? They're recurrent thoughts and they're intrusive in the sense that they're thoughts that you don't want to have. They might be urges that you have, but it's a thing that you can't. It's a thing that you can't quit thinking about. And the most common manifestation of this is an obsession with germs. So you have this obsession with cleanliness and germs, and you can't get the idea. Like I just rubbed my nose, for example, right? Well, if I had OCD, I might suddenly become obsessed with the fact that maybe I just smeared coronavirus into my nose, right? Despite the fact that I haven't left my house in a couple of days. But, and I've washed my hands a lot since. But I might have this thought that I've got germs on my hands and I can't quit thinking about it, right? And it causes me this inordinate amount of anxiety, and I can't get the anxiety to go away, and I can't quit thinking about it. So in order to get that anxiety to go away, I engage in a compulsive behavior to alleviate that anxiety. In this case, I compulsively hand wash. So what happens is I have this obsession with, and I don't actually have this, by the way, I'm just using this as an example. I've got the obsession with germs on my hands. So to make that anxiety go away caused by that obsession, I go wash my hands. And then what magically happens after I wash my hands? Well, at least for a few minutes, my anxiety is alleviated. So this is negative reinforcement, right? Like we talked about in chapter 6, it makes the anxiety go away. So the hand washing behavior is negatively reinforced because it makes your anxiety go away. So this creates this self-perpetuating cycle. Every time you wash your hands, you feel better, at least temporarily, until the next thoughts pop up and you need to do it again. And the more you engage in the compulsive behavior, the more it's reinforced. And it's like a vicious snowballing effect. It's like a cycle, right? The more you do it, the more it's reinforced, the more it's reinforced, the more you do it. So it's a vicious cycle. And it's a hard cycle to get out of once it's like your brain getting stuck in a broken record rut, kind of. It is kind of an analogy here. And, it doesn't just necessarily have to be with germs. There are some folks who are obsessed with the thought that they just ran over somebody on the road. This really happens. I've read case studies of people who they're on their way to work in the morning and they feel a bump in the road as they're driving down the highway, and they think they've just run over a dead body, right? Even though it was probably just a pothole or a bump, they think they've just run over a dead body. So what do? To make the anxiety go away, they turn around, they go back, and they look for the dead body and they can't find it. So it might happen like this. So the first time you go back, you look for the dead body in the middle of the road, you don't see a body in the middle of the road, you're like, okay, good deal, I didn't run over anybody. So you try to head on to work. But then after you get a couple miles down the road, the thought pops into your head, well, maybe when I ran into the body in the road, maybe the force of the impact from the car pushed the body off the side of the road, knocked it off the side of the road into the ditch. So you go back again a second time and you stop the car and you look in the ditches and you can't find the body in the ditch. And you're satisfied for a second. You're like, okay, I didn't run over anybody, time to head to work. But then you get a few miles down the road and you think, well, what if I hit the body and the impact pushed the body off into the ditch, and before I got back, a wild animal like a bear or something or an alligator dragged the body off into the woods, and that's the reason I didn't see it. So you go back a third time, and this time you park your car and you stop and you're off on an adventure in the woods looking for the wild animal that dragged the body off into the woods. And I know this sounds absolutely fantastic and ridiculous to people who don't suffer from this, but this happens to people, right? You might spend the next 2 hours of your life looking for the dead body of a person who never existed, right? And you're 2 hours late for work. Or maybe you can't get the thought out of your head that you left your house unlocked or your coffee pot turned on. So you go back repeatedly to your house to check and recheck and recheck. And you spend your whole morning going back to check and recheck. And that's the compulsive behavior. So the disorder takes a number of different forms, but it's debilitating. And the best treatments that we have for it involve a combination of medication and behavioral therapy, which is helpful for a lot of folks. And again, we'll talk more about treatments in the last chapter. But the last thing that I want to show you guys today is a video on obsessive compulsive disorder. So for those of you who are watching the recording, this will be the end of the video for you guys because I'm about to play a copyrighted video. And if you want to see the video that I'm sharing with the class right now live, you'll have to email me and I would be glad to send you the link to the video that I'm about to play. So this is it for those of you who are watching the recording.